Hello, friends. Today we're going to be discussing Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, and this is going to be the first edition of a new, loosely reoccurring series titled Reading the Classics. I know, creative title, but it does the trick. And in the series, I don't have any set schedule or reading list that I'm going to be referring to, but really, as I work through the Western canon of classical literature myself, I just want to use this series as an opportunity to discuss, review, and elaborate upon my thoughts after reading different classic books like Pride and Prejudice. And the only prerequisite I'm going to have for the series is that the classics have to be 19th century or older. So any of those amazing 20th century books that are technically classics, they won't be in this series. But anyway, let's get to this book, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Now, brief background about why I read this book in the first place and a little bit of context to Jane Austen and the general time period that she's writing this book. I read Pride and Prejudice with my wife, and my wife is heavily into fiction and the fantasy world, romantic books, all of that. So if you look at her side of the library, it is full of beautiful, colorful, vibrant books and a lot of contemporary stories. And then if you look at the books on my shelf, they're a lot more dull and mundane and boring looking. So this was an opportunity for us to share our passion of reading and kind of meet in the middle or compromise with our literary taste. And as far as this book specifically, Jane Austen, writing in the late 1700s into the early 1800s, she actually wrote the kind of foundations of Pride and Prejudice when she was only 20 years old, which is just insane. It was finished and published later in life. But Jane Austen written, I think it's 4 or 5 key novels in her lifetime, and she was writing, of course, in England. And thinking about context too, especially as it pertains to this book, you have to think about the time that she's writing where women don't have nearly the equality, opportunity, and liberation that they do today. That seems quite obvious, but it's important to state that because a lot of this book centers around the conception of marriage, the utility of it, the foundations of it. And so with this historical context in mind, you can see why it was essential for a woman to marry wisely. When she was looking for a partner or she was being courted by a male, she had to understand his financial well-being, his social status, what he was entitled to, if his parents were to pass away, what land he owned. All of this was crucial to what was going to become her well-being if she married into that family. So you see a lot of these layers within Pride and Prejudice about, are you marrying for social status? Are you marrying within the prestige of a royal family? Are you marrying for connections and potential opportunities? Are you marrying for your own personal happiness? Are you marrying for pure erratic love and passion? So these are some of the things you have to think about, especially as it pertains to this time period that's obviously quite different to today. And you also have to think about in the time that Jane Austen was writing, she played a lot more of a middle ground position when it comes to feminist ideology or female liberation. So you have Mary Wollstonecraft on one side, pushing very hard and rightfully so for women to have equal opportunity both in education and finances and in all areas within society. But then you have other women as well at the time writing that women have a specific place in society, they are unequal to men, etc., etc. A lot of it coming from a religious standpoint. And Jane Austen kind of rides a little bit of that middle ground within this book. So, with all that said, let's dive into some of my initial impressions and thoughts of the book. Heading into the book, I gotta be completely honest, I was not that excited or expecting that much from it, primarily because I've never read a romantic novel before. Of course, there's been romantic relationships and love affairs in most of the novels I've read, but it hasn't been essential or the core piece of the novel or plot. So this was very different for me, and heading into it, I felt like I already had a feel where things were going. I saw the trajectory. You got Elizabeth Bennet, and she's standoffish and doesn't like this man, Mr. Darcy, and Darcy is against her and not interested in her, and eventually they start to love each other and happily ever after, right? I thought it was going to be this very dull, mundane, predictable story. And there certainly were sections that are predictable, and you kind of see where things are leading, but the story is far more complex than that. And as the characters develop, and especially in such unique ways, because the story is almost entirely dialogue. That was also a very interesting shift for me to kind of get used to, was The way that Jane Austen at least writes Pride and Prejudice is it's like 80% dialogue. You get very little description of people, which I'll kind of describe later as a bit of a con, but you don't really find out much about what people look like, the setting. They don't describe the buildings or the rooms they're in. It's heavy on dialogue. But I think that actually works well for this novel because you're able to get this dynamism between characters and this roller coaster ride of character development, I think, within a few essential characters. And through that, I just became enthralled by volume 2 and definitely into volume 3. I was, smiling at certain sentences. I felt, warm and fuzzy at certain parts, which I never would have expected to feel. And so from where my first impressions were of this, predictable, trite, romantic story to where it actually ended up and what is encased within this novel, I was humbled and I was corrected. And in a way, I had to renounce my own prejudices and pride about this book. So maybe it's serendipitous in that way. Now let's dive into the characters and the plot itself. So you have Elizabeth Bennet, the heroine of the story, and she's one of 5 daughters within the Bennet family. She's the second oldest, right underneath Jane. And Elizabeth stands out primarily because she's this very lively, wise, rational woman. She isn't so infatuated with materialism or the courting of male figures like her younger daughters, such as Lydia. But she's also not just fixated on marriage for the utility of marriage itself as her mother is, or even in a sense that her older sister Jane is. She's not really seeking marriage as this must-have, I guess I say. It's not at the top of her mind.
I've not the least intention of dancing. Please don't suppose that I moved this way in order to beg for a partner.
And because of that, she is able to analyze these different relationships within the novel and see their errors or their faults, see why they're sacrificing their personal happiness for worldly prosperity or purely for a passionate engagement. She can see that it's an irrational love. And so she says on page, quote, "Do not consider me now as an elegant female intending to plague you, but as a rational creature speaking the truth from her heart." So she's very steadfast in her opinions and her belief, and this is tying into the concept of prejudice. She has these preconceived notions. She's very strong and dogmatic in her beliefs and her positions, and her counterpart is Darcy Fitzwilliam, who is extremely wealthy. He owns Pemberley, this beautiful estate. He, quote, makes $10,000 a year.
10,000 a year at least.
And he's full of pride, and he's very pompous, he's very taciturn, and he seems very disagreeable to most people.
Your defect is a propensity to hate everyone.
Well, yours is willfully to misunderstand them.
And I kind of relate to him in this way a little bit as a bit of an introvert myself, who's a little bit picky with who I will engage with or entertain in a conversation, probably to a fault. But here on 81, I think it summarizes it quite well. Quote, "But Mr. Darcy can please where he chooses. He does not want abilities. He can be a conversive companion if he thinks it worth his while." So early in the first volume, we see these two conflicting personalities collide, and there aren't many sparks between them. They're kind of disinterested in each other, but they do start to recognize, hey, we might have a little bit more in common than we realize. This kind of standoffish personality trait that they both have, maybe there's something there. And we see on page 90, Elizabeth wisely points out, quote, "For I have always seen a great similarity in the turn of our minds. We are each of an unsocial, taciturn disposition, unwilling to speak unless we expect to say something that will amaze the whole room and be handed down to prosperity with all the eclat of a proverb." And towards the end of the novel, Elizabeth wisely points out that the reason that she aroused the interest of Darcy in the first place and really bewitched him was that she was different. She was, quote, unlike them, unlike the other girls that are only interested in Darcy to gain his attention, to marry him for their own financial prosperity, to be the lady of Pemberley, etc., etc. Let's put a pin in that for now and discuss some of the other key characters within the novel. So, one important note to make about the Bennet family is that because it is a family full of daughters, there's no clear heir to the land, to the estate that Mr. Bennet owns. It actually goes to Mr. Collins, which we'll discuss in a moment. But because of that, Miss Bennet and all the daughters have a very strong imperative to marry wisely and ideally marry upward because they are not going to be incumbent to any land, any estate, and really much wealth. And this leads Miss Bennet to push very strongly, quite irritatingly to the daughters, for marriage. Just push them, doesn't care about their happiness, doesn't care about the well-being of the union or the relationship that is occurring, but just focuses on what they can gain from the marriage. And Mr. Bennet is quite the opposite. He does not want to get involved in the affairs. He just wants to seclude himself to his office, to his study, so he can read. And he very much more associates with Elizabeth because of her rational thinking, because of her consideration of having a partner that not only supports her financially, but more so supports her ambitions and her liveliness and all of that. And on the other side, we have Jane and then the other daughters that are keen on finding a great partner. So Jane specifically is being courted by Mr. Bingley, who has recently purchased an estate close by to the Bennets. And so Miss Bennet quickly slides in and says, hey, we got to meet this new guy and try and partner up one of my 5 daughters with this wealthy man that just moved into the area. Jane happens to be the lucky woman that Mr. Bingley starts to court. And they have their relationship, they have their ups and downs, which we'll get to in a moment. Now, a couple other characters and character dynamics that are going on within the novel is you have Mr. Bingley's sister, who is trying to pursue Mr. Darcy and also set up her brother, Mr. Bingley, with Darcy's sister to kind of build this power family, in a sense, with 2 interfamily marriages. And then you also have Elizabeth Bennet's cousin, Mr. Collins, who is, of course, the one, as I mentioned earlier, inheriting their home and land, basically. He kind of slides in and wants to marry her because this wealthy woman, Lady Catherine, suggests that as a man in the clergy, he should marry a wonderful woman. So he tries to pursue Elizabeth because she's in the family. A little weird, but because she's in the family. And she turns her nose and says, no way, Mr. Collins is this silly, conceited, pompous man. I'm not interested at all. What does he do? 2 days later, he turns around and proposes to Elizabeth's friend, Charlotte, and ends up marrying her. So that goes on. And then you have a bunch of aunt, uncles, and some side characters. And the last key character within this novel is Mr. Wickham. And he is just a scoundrel. He is just a pain in the ass, honestly, for a lot of characters within this novel. And he has this kind of veil of seeming like a good character, of seeming like this very agreeable, honorable man. But throughout the novel, you just start to hate him a lot more, you know. And so that leads us to some of the main themes and motifs within this novel. The first one has to be this conception of marriage. And this is why I think the novel is such a classic and is timeless, is because marriage, relationships, however you want to think about it, are so central to society, to love and to happiness. And this is why I think the novel is a bona fide classic and timeless, because this conception of marriage, balance of happiness and equality within a relationship is absolutely timeless. As much as things have changed dramatically since the late 18th century, much of the way that we understand marriage and think about love and relationships and the happiness of ourselves and our partner, not much has changed. And that's the biggest takeaway, and why I really want to make this series, is talking about how human conditions and relations haven't changed that much century after century. Sure, a lot of the way that things visually look, the appearance of things, maybe the structural elements have changed a little bit, or get swapped around. There's been a lot more, obviously, women empowerment and equality for women in society. But the way that we still value and use marriage in society is not that far removed from how it was when Austen wrote this novel. So, with that in mind, the best place to start and discuss this theme of marriage is the first sentence in the novel, which goes like this: "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife." Simply put, what is it to have all this material wealth, opportunity, connections, you have the world at your palm, if you can't share it with a woman or an individual that you love, if you can't share it with your family? if you have all the wealth and prosperity in the world, but you don't have family, what is it all for? And so that's something we battle with a lot here in societies. You can have all this material success and this materialism, but what is it really for if your relationships, if your marriage, if your happiness is in a dilapidated state? Shifting back towards marriage, we see that there are a myriad of reasons why one would marry in the first place. And it seems like Austen plants a different reason or purpose for marriage within each relationship or engagement. For example, Mr. Wickham is very focused on the financial gain that marriage can provide. So he's seeking a partner that can help him resolve his debts. And then we have Mr. Collins, who's purely marrying just for kind of the social status element of it, or to have a wife and a household. We have Miss Bingley, who's focused on gaining wealth, power, and social status through these interfamily marriages that she's trying to coerce or instigate. And we also have the relationship between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, where Mr. Bennet initially married her for her beauty and her charm, but later in the relationship, he's just lost all affection for her because of the inequality in their personality and their values. So he says on page 228, quote, "Her father, captivated by youth and beauty and that appearance of good humor which youth and beauty generally give, had married a woman whose weak understanding and illiberal mind had very early in their marriage put an end to all real affection for her. Respect, esteem, and confidence had vanished forever, and all his views of domestic happiness were overthrown." So it shows how marrying for vanity or for mere appearance of somebody can be a mistake, because marriage is not temporary. It's not a fling. It's not, this one night stand type of venture. And if you want to have long-lasting happiness, a successful marriage that's not only successful for financial reasons or for the outside perception of status, it needs to be founded in a not only a love for each other, but a balance between two different temperaments or characters, that by fusing together, you're not only able to coexist with your partner, but you actually lift each other up. You become a better person because of this fusing together. And marriage is traditionally thought of as becoming one. And this leads us into the topic of happiness, which is a very crucial theme as well that runs throughout the entire book. Just like marriage, we see different flavors, you could say, of happiness, where we have worldly prosperity and social status, we have financial prosperity, we have rational happiness, we have emotional happiness, we have personal happiness, and all of these, again, bleed into different characters and their relationships, respectively. A couple things to, again, build upon is thinking about how Miss Bingley is solely focused on the happiness of the material benefits and the social benefits that she can gain through these relationships and marriages she's trying to create. We also have Mr. Wickham, as I mentioned earlier, with his profligate behavior and his indulgences. He's focused on marrying purely for the material benefits and the financial benefits that he can gain. And then we have Elizabeth, Mr. Darcy, and even Mr. Bennet that value rational happiness first and foremost. They're not interested in what is so useful about marriage or what they can gain from it, but they're focused on what's going to bring me happiness, what's going to improve my well-being, especially long term. They're not focused on what Lady Catherine wants them to do. They're not focused on what society thinks or what their parents think or why they should marry so-and-so or another, what's useful, what's approved by society. They're focused on what's going to make me happy. Is this individual, is this partner going to bring me greater happiness and well-being long term?
We all know him to be a proud, unpleasant sort of man. But this would be nothing if you really liked him.
I do. I do like him. I love him.
And we see this within Jane and Mr. Bingley, especially after they've gone through some turbulence within their relationship. Once Jane and Mr. Bingley come together, Mr. Bingley has proposed, Elizabeth notices that their relationship is foundationally based in reason. It's rational happiness. So on page 328, quote, "Elizabeth really believed all his expectations of felicity to be rationally founded because they had for basis the excellent understanding and super excellent disposition of Jane and a general similarity of feeling and taste between her and himself." So again, their taste, their personality, their traits, they bond well together. They're actually good partners that work well together. They're not just marrying due to use, because, oh, if we marry this person with so and so, this is good for our family, or this can allow you to gain wealth, or whatever it is. No. Are these two individuals that are becoming, or that are coming together as a union, are they going to be happy with each other? That's what Elizabeth and even Jane Austen is focused on with marriage, which is very different. Again, we might think that's obvious now today. We see the rare situation of gold diggers, or people marrying because of what their family wants to do, or we do still see some culturally organized marriages in different countries or cultures, but generally we have more freedom of choosing partners today. But at this time, this was a much more nuanced, raw idea, to think that you can just marry who you actually want without the kind of considerations of society, family, wealth, etc. And when it comes to Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth themselves, our main characters, we see that by the end of the novel, their relationship is, again, rooted in the idea that by the merging of each other, they become better. And I think of them almost like peanut butter and jelly, A peanut butter sandwich by itself, not the best. A jelly sandwich, not the best. But you know what? Together, they're perfect. Peanut butter and jelly, hard to beat. And that's how I think of it, because she says, quote, on 295, she now began to comprehend that he was exactly the man who, in disposition and talents, would most suit her. His understanding and temper, though unlike her own, would have answered all her wishes. It was a union that must have been to the advantage of both. Peanut butter and jelly. And to round out this talk on happiness, I want to end with this page that I absolutely adore. The section closer to the end of the novel where Mr. Bennet is talking to Elizabeth, and she's confessing her love for Mr. Darcy, says they're going to get married, and Mr. Bennet's just inquiring, do you really love him? Is he going to make you happy? And he says, quote, I know that you could be neither happy nor respectable unless you truly esteemed your husband, unless you looked up to him as a superior. Your lively talents would place you in the greatest danger in an unequal marriage. And this to me is the beauty of marriage. It's not so much the idea of what can they do for me, but it's this mixture of self-sacrifice, compromise with the other individual, the way that the other individual, your partner, lifts you up, complements you well between their behaviors, their traits, their talents, and your own, that makes, again, the sum greater than its individual parts. And to wrap up, we cannot finish this book discussion unless we talk about the pride and the prejudice. So let's talk about it. Mr. Darcy obviously is that caricature for pride. He is prideful, he's pompous, he's, isolated in this way.
Did you ever meet such a proud, disagreeable man?
Ma, he will hate you.
I don't care if he does.
But he's this very prideful character. He seems disagreeable on the outside, which is why, a bunch of characters, Miss Bennet, the gardeners initially, obviously Elizabeth, thinks he's this jerk. He's this disagreeable jerk that, everyone's repulsed by him, and she can think nothing positive of him. But again, that comes from her prejudice. It comes from her misconceived notions that that's all he is. He's just an angry, upset man, which she doesn't really realize why that might be the case. But to stay on the idea of Darcy, we see transformation occur within his character. He starts to sacrifice some of his own rigidity, and he starts to changes his character for Elizabeth. Through his love and passion for Elizabeth and his admiration of her, he changes his character. He becomes a lot more social than he'd like to be, which I think I do for my wife too. I'll engage in the small talk at the the dinner party or whatever if I have to, just to be approachable. And so he does that with the gardeners when Elizabeth is touring there at Pemberley, and she notices, like, man, he's really changing. He's a lot, more agreeable. He's a lot nicer. He's more engaging. This isn't the man I remember. And over the novel, slowly but surely, he changes. And specifically when it comes to his pride and his grievances with Wickham, we see that by the end of the novel, he makes big sacrifices and gives up his ego, admits his pride in order to obtain a happy relationship with Elizabeth. He sacrifices himself. And then on the flip side, we have little Miss Elizabeth with all her prejudices and premature judgments of different individuals, where she originally thinks Mr. Wickham is a good guy, finds out he's a bad guy, finds out Mr. Darcy's actually a pretty good guy, and realizes that she's wrong. She thinks herself almost, too smart. She thinks herself, she's very dogmatic in this way, where she just thinks her initial impression of somebody is always right. And that's the whole prejudice side of things. And slowly over the novel, as Mr. Darcy is changing and as she's realizing there's a lot more complexity to each of these different characters and individuals she meets, she evolves as well. She begins to swallow and erase a lot of those prejudices that she has. And I really like this one quote that she says as she's talking to Mr. Darcy on page 348. She says, quote, "You must learn some of my philosophy. Think only of the past as its remembrance gives you pleasure." And it doesn't tie too much to the happiness thing, but I love this quote, totally separate from the book as well. Only think about the past as much as it gives you, warm, enjoyable feelings and memories. Don't dawn too much, I think it's been said before, it's in the rear view for a reason. It's behind you, leave it there. Focus on, what's in front of you. So, without making this video too long, though it's probably too long anyway, what are my final thoughts on Pride and Prejudice? Beautiful novel, absolute classic, and for good reason. As I said, all the notions of marriage, relationships, happiness, self-sacrifice, these are timeless ideas. They're timeless abstractions that we still ponder about and think about today. What does it mean to sacrifice for someone else? Why should we not purely focus on our own personal happiness and fulfilling our own sensations and erratic love and passions? Why should we think beyond materialism or what you can do for me or what this marriage can do for me? How do we think about pursuing our happiness in general? How do we think about pride and prejudice and giving people, some breathing room for our first impressions of them? All of these things are timeless. And this book it surprised me. Again, I'd never read a romantic novel before. I definitely haven't read too many books from the female perspective. And it was nice to kind of get that view of things, And I found it to be very charming. The first volume, I'll admit, was a little bit slow. The second started to pick up a lot more. And by the third volume, I was reeling. I was enthralled with the book. I was reading it fast. I was so engaged. And to me, that just showed that it's a book that builds, and it's a book that's very worthy. It's not too long. It's, around 350-ish pages, something like that. So it's of good substance. The only con I'll say about the book, or a gripe I had, was that there isn't that much visual description. Everyone is described as handsome, and you don't really get an idea. Okay, well, what is handsome? What is that supposed to mean? I don't think there's a single hair color described. They talk about Elizabeth's eyes, but they don't really say anything other than they're like, beautiful or enticing. They don't really describe what color they are. You don't really get an idea of what kind of body shape people have for the most part. It is leaves much to the interpretation of the reader, I'll say. So heavy on dialogue, lacking, leaves a lot to desire with visual description, besides the brief section where Austen is describing the land of Pemberley, or the estate overall. But overall, love the novel. Definitely plan to read more of Jane Austen in the future. Yeah, I mean, it was exciting. I kept telling my wife, I was like, read faster because I'm passing you. I'm lapping you on this book. But with all that said, let me know what you guys think. If you read this before, if you read it again and watch this video, let me know what you think. Are there other Austen books that are better than this one? What do you think? What should be my next classic that I read and we discuss here on the channel? Let me know in the comments down below. Like the video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe for more content like this. And I'll catch you guys in the next one.